taken out by investors in year 2000. The top 20 countries in patenting, all high-income countries, account for 98% of all patents. Now you see why we export cocoa beans, right? And they bring in tens of products back that are patented, we cannot copy or we cannot duplicate, but we end up buying. They are also the largest investors in what? In education. So we are going to see where the problem is. What we basically do as a company is this. If you have issues, right, we come to you, we look at your processes, we look at the deficiencies, we look at the gaps. We are able to identify these factors, right, by working backwards. We look at your finances, cost control, operations, sales and marketing. And by the time we walk backwards some years into your operations, we are able to detect what the problem is and where you took the wrong turn. So in the case of Nigeria, what I simply did was to take Nigeria back 57 years, right from 1960. In the 60s, it was good, right? In the 70s, it was good. So what were we doing at those periods? And where did we go wrong? So if you look at the net or adjusted net savings of a country, right? Net national savings plus education expenditure, is equals to net national savings plus education expenditure depletion minus damage from carbon dioxide emission minus damage from particulate emission. What does it tell us? Every mineral resources you have, right, is on the minus. For instance, if you have 500 million barrels of crude buried underground, right, by the time you start extracting it, next year you cannot sell that oil well for the same price. But the difference in education is this. Whatever you put in a child, whatever you put in an individual, right, that investment increases the value of that person. And that person's worth is increased. This is the value that the Western world, Europe, North America, right, and the Asian countries have now adopted. But the interesting thing that you will see through data is why our economy was progressing in the 60s and 70s, what we were doing. Now, we conducted the research using data from 80 countries, countries from 6 continents, narrowed down to about 3 countries per continent. All 80 countries proved our hypothesis correct. Asia and Africa were serious case study for Nigeria. Why? Because some of the countries that have overtaken us today, we were ahead of them in the 60s and 70s. And then when we matched this data, everything became clear what we were doing wrong. Nigeria was ahead in per capita income compared to some Asian and African countries in the early 80s. And these countries are ahead of us today. So, this is our GDP. As I said, I'm taking the country back 57 years to 1960. In 1960, our GDP was 4.2 billion. By 1970, it had increased to 12.6 billion. And by 1981, it had increased to 61.1 billion. By 2014, it had increased to 569 billion. Now, the next slide shows our education expenditure. In 1970, right, we had an education expenditure of $185.7 million with a population of 56 million people. And that 185.7 million represented 1.47% of the budget. Remember, the UN says what? 5% of your what? Your GDP. Or 26% of your budget. This figure represented 1.47% of our GDP, rather, not budget. By 1981, if you look at the graph, right, we had started increasing the education budget. The education budget had started going up. We started conforming with what UN was saying, right? And by 1981, we had reached 3 billion, representing 4.9%, approximately what? 5%. And by 1981, we had a population of 75 million people. But the interesting thing was to happen. From 1982, education expenditure started reducing. And by 1986, with a population of 86.1 million people, education budget had reduced to less than $1 billion. And that year, it was 608 million, representing 2.9%. And then it stayed below $1 billion for 20 years. It wasn't until 2006 that education expenditure on the federal level went above $1 billion for the first time in 20 years. By 2006, we had hit a population of 145 million people. And education expenditure was 1.19 billion, representing 0.8% of the GDP. By 2011, 30 years after, education expenditure went back to what it was in 1981. You know why I'm saying this? What is the wealth of a nation? What is the wealth of a nation? It is the people. The people are the wealth of a nation. But the reverse is what we are practicing in Africa. We believe that the mineral resources is our wealth, right? The Western world believes that the wealth of a nation is what? Is the people. And that's why they invest in human capital development. Your mineral resources will continue to be depleted, but people will continue to what? Increase. Now, by 2011, the education expenditure or investment represented 0.8% at 3.3 billion of GDP, right? Now, the interesting thing is this. The 3 billion we had in 1981 was 4.9%, right? But the 3 billion we had in 2011 was 0.8%. In fact, from 1981 or 1982, when it started dropping, it reached an all-time low in 1991 of 0.77%. And it had remained at 0.8% ever since. The truth is, we are the investment of the country, but the government is not investing in us. And that's where the real problem is. By 2014, at 177.5 million people, education expenditure was 4.6 billion, still representing 0.8%. While we may think it's an increase, right, from 1981, it's actually not an increase because it's now catering for more people. So in 33 years, population increased by 134%. Education expenditure only increased by 1.6 billion and representing 53.7%. But this is the interesting thing. Let's go to the next slide. Now, if you look at this slide, right, in 1960, our per capita income was 93. By 1970, it had increased to 224. By 1980, 871. And by 1981, 807. As we were increasing education expenditure, our per capita income was increasing. That was because we were investing in people. We were investing in education. We were investing in the right skills, right? But look at, from 1982, our per capita income also started reducing. In all the 80 countries that we surveyed, no country ever reduced education expenditure for more than 3-4 years maximum. We reduced in 30 years. 30 years. So you can now see why everybody's running abroad to school, right? So what we did is to compare Nigeria with other countries and see where we are. This is Chile, South America. If you look at the education expenditure, I don't know if it's that clear. Chile, in 44 years, we took from 1970 to 2014. Chile, in 44 years, have invested 120.5 billion in education. Nigeria has only invested 48 billion. Chile has a population of 17.8 million people, 10% of our population. And you can see, as they increase education expenditure, right? Their per capita income. This is the per capita income. Chile has a better per capita income than us because they are arming people with the right what? The right education and the right skills. The next. That's the per capita income of Chile compared to Nigeria. The next is Brazil. Brazil, with a population of 206 million people, have invested $1.5 trillion in 44 years. Nigeria has only invested 48 billion. You can see the per capita income, the disparities in per capita income. The next one is Mexico. Mexico, with a population of 125 million people, as in 2014, we used 2014 because all data were updated to 2014. Mexico, by 2014, in 44 years, have spent or invested 882 billion on education, compared to Nigeria with 178 million people that have only invested 48 billion. And you can see the income disparity between Mexico and Nigeria. Canada, with a population of only 35 million people, have spent $1.6 trillion that they've invested on their people in 44 years, compared to Nigeria, 48. You can also see the income disparities between Canada and Nigeria. These are the developed world, right? From Canada upward, I'm going to be discussing the developed world. Now, this is the United States. Now, I know why you're shouting. See, this is the reason why everybody goes to the US. This is the reason why everybody wants to go to the US. In 2014 alone, the US invested 900 billion. 900 billion in education. You see why all the innovations are coming out from the US, right? They are investing in their people. And that was why in the previous slides, right? They said all African nations only accounted for 1% of all the what? Patented products that came out from the US in year 2000. That's the US in 44 years. The US has invested 17.16 trillion. We go to United Kingdom. I'm just going to breeze through this, right? United Kingdom have invested 2.7 trillion in 44 years. And that's their GDP per capita. Germany has invested $3.5 trillion on education investment in 44 years. And that's their GDP per capita, as the income disparity is shown compared to that of Nigeria. Australia has invested $950 billion in 44 years compared to Nigeria. But the interesting thing is that when we got to countries like Egypt, right? I want you to look at the graph. Now, you see that the blue line, right, was ahead in the 70s. There was a time we had South Africans, East Africans, West Africans, North Africans, even the Arab nations, right, come to study. This was the time when the government was investing in us. When the government gave us good education, pumped money in education. By 1981, right, Nigeria had reached $3 billion in education expenditure, compared to Egypt that year at 717. We were ahead. But look at the graph. Egypt remained on course. They did not reduce it. And by 2014, Egypt had reached an all-time high of 12.97 billion, compared to Nigeria at 4.6 billion that year. And then when you look at the next slide, you see that Egypt has overtaken us in per capita income. That is why we are now going to Egypt today to school. Now, but the interesting thing is, we now saw that Egypt's per capita income, the disparity was not that wide. So what were they doing wrong? We went into their budget and the country as a whole and the economy. And what we found out was interesting. Egypt is the 12th largest country in Africa. But 90% of Egyptian land is what? Desert. 90 million people only live on 10% of the land in the northeast, city of Alexandria, Cairo, Port Said, and the cities along the Nile. Egypt is an economically disadvantaged country.